Okay, let's get started. We have a lot to get through today. We're going to try to get all the way down to the end of the digestive tract. Okay? And then Friday we'll get started on the reproductive systems. So, when we left off on Monday, I had showed you a video that went through the process of swallowing. Swallowing involves the tongue moving food back. It involves pushing the food into your pharynx, and then from there it goes down into the esophagus, and eventually it gets down to the stomach. So that's the next part of the digestive system I wanted to talk about. So this is a diagram of the stomach from your textbook. And I went ahead and added some larger labels just right before class today because labels were rather small. I thought they were a little bit hard to read, at least they were for me. However, I just realized there was one part that I missed that I should have labeled. These are the ones I want to emphasize. One part that I forgot to add a label for, which I think is important, is this one right here, the body of the stomach. The body of the stomach is the middle. It's the middle portion. It's everything between the cardiac region and the pyloric region. That's the body. Kind of like the body of the uterus, okay, in the female reproductive system. So there are several regions of the stomach. This first part that food first enters from the esophagus is called the cardiac region. Okay, I'm not sure why they call it that, but it's the part of the stomach closest to the heart. That's probably why it's called the cardiac region. It's not right next to the heart, but it's the closest part to the heart. So they call this the cardiac region. Now there's also a kind of a dome-shaped portion just superior to the cardiac region. That's called the fundus, or the fundal region. Okay, that's seen mainly externally. There's kind of an external bump or an elevation. That's called the fundic region. Then in the middle, as I said, you have the body. That's right here. It's this whole middle portion. And then the lower part of the stomach is called the pyloric region. Okay, so there's a cardiac region, a fundic region, a body, and then a pyloric region. Okay. In addition, there are two sphincters that control movement of food into and out of the stomach. So the first one is up here right at the junction between the esophagus and the cardiac region. There's a sphincter muscle, which is a circular arrangement of smooth muscle fibers called the cardiac sphincter. And the cardiac sphincter relaxes during swallowing to allow food to enter the stomach. And then once the food has entered the stomach, that cardiac sphincter contracts and it closes off that opening between the stomach and the esophagus. That's important because if acid from the stomach were to get up into the esophagus, it could digest away the walls of the esophagus and cause problems. So, and then at the bottom of the stomach, in the lower part, there's a pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter stays closed right after you eat food to ensure that the food that's stored in the stomach gets mixed with the digestive enzymes and also the hydrochloric acid that the stomach also produces. Hydrochloric acid actually activates one of the enzymes that breaks down protein. And so once that partial digestion takes place, then the pyloric sphincter relaxes, and then that allows the food to go down into the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. All right? So The main function of the stomach is kind of twofold. The first is that it provides a storage area for food, so that you can eat food rather quickly, and then later on when you're resting, you can digest that food. And then the other main function is there is some chemical digestion that takes place in the stomach. There's a digestive enzyme called pepsinogen, which is secreted by the stomach. Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme, and it's converted into the active form, which is called pepsin, by the stomach acid, which is in the form of hydrochloric acid. So the pH of the stomach is very, very low. That low pH also helps to destroy any bacteria that you might consume along with your food. Okay, because most bacteria are destroyed by that low pH of the acid. Okay, then in addition, there are two external features of the stomach. Stomach is sort of a J-shaped organ, and along the upper and left-hand margin of the stomach, there's a curve. And this curved portion, right here on this side of the stomach, is called the lesser curvature. Then on the opposite side, so on the lower side and the left-hand side of the stomach, there's a much longer curvature. This is the longer side of the stomach. That's called the greater curvature. So on this diagram, there's a little curved area down here that's labeled greater curvature, and I added a larger label here so you can see a little more easily. What I didn't have time to do is extend that curved arrow, because the greater curvature extends all the way along that side of the stomach. This whole thing is the greater curvature. Same thing on the other side. This whole side is the lesser curvature of the stomach. So those are just kind of two landmarks that are used to identify the different sides of the stomach. Okay, any questions? All right, so let's take a closer look at the wall of the stomach. The stomach walls are made up of the same four layers that any other part of the digestive tract are made up. There's a mucosa, which is adjacent to the lumen of the stomach. Lumen is the hollow portion inside the stomach. The mucosa of the stomach is highly folded into folds that are called rugae. And in the inward folds of the rugae, they form kind of long pits that are called gastric glands. Those gastric glands produce a number of different kinds of enzymes, some of which digest proteins, at least partially digest proteins. There's a gastric lipase that digests fats, and there's also cells that produce the hydrochloric acid. And there's also mucus secreting cells. And those are important because the mucus helps coat the inside of the stomach so it doesn't get digested by the hydrochloric acid that it produces. So mucus sort of protects it from the hydrochloric acid. Then there's below the mucosa, there's a submucosa, which consists mostly of connective tissue and a few blood vessels. Then there's a muscularis, which is made up of 3 layers of smooth muscle in the stomach. Most of the parts of the digestive tract only have 2 layers. And most parts have a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. The stomach has a 3rd layer called the oblique layer, in addition to the other 2. And then finally, on the outside of the stomach, there's a thin layer of connective tissue called the serosa. Okay. Those are the 4 layers that make up the stomach. So this is a close-up view of one of those gastric glands, which are formed by the gastric, shows the gastric glands that are part of the gastric pits. that are formed by those folds of the mucosa. And I've listed some of the substances that are secreted by those gastric glands. The hydrochloric acid is produced there in those pits. Pepsinogen, which is converted to pepsin by the hydrochloric acid. Gastric lipase, which breaks down fats and lipids. Also secretes a hormone, believe it or not. So stomach is actually an endocrine gland, secretes a hormone called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is needed to absorb vitamin B12. And does anybody know what do you need vitamin B12 for? What does vitamin B12 do for you? Well, you need vitamin B12 to synthesize red blood cells. So if you don't get enough vitamin B12, you can end up having anemia. It can cause anemia. And even if you have a lot of vitamin B12 in your diet, if you don't have enough intrinsic factor, which is produced by your stomach, you're not going to be able to absorb that vitamin B12. So you might have to administer vitamin B12 by injection rather than rather than orally if there's a problem with not having enough intrinsic factor. And then finally, there's a hormone that's involved in hunger called ghrelin. It's also produced by the stomach. All right, so salivary and the gastric enzymes partially digest protein and lesser amounts of starch and fat in the stomach, but almost all chemical digestion and nearly all absorption of nutrients occurs in the small intestine. So the function of the small intestines are primarily digestion and absorption. So that's the next part of the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, but right near the first part of the small intestine, there are three accessory organs that add secretions to the food that passes through the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. These three accessory organs are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And so we're gonna take a look at those organs first, and then we'll before we go on and take a look at the three different regions of the small intestines. So the liver is the largest internal organ of the body, and it has a lot of different functions, but only one of them is related to digestion, and that's the secretion of bile. Secretion of bile is one of the main functions of the liver. Bile is a green fluid that breaks down large fat droplets into smaller fat droplets. So bile is involved in the physical breakdown of fat droplets. Doesn't really digest the fat though. To do that, you need lipases. But by breaking down large droplets into smaller droplets, that increases the surface area of the fat droplets that are exposed to the lipases. So it speeds up the breakdown of fat by breaking down big droplets into small droplets. Because bigger droplets have less surface to volume ratio than small droplets. So there's more of the lipid molecules that are exposed in the small droplets for the lipases to work on. So this is two different views of the liver. The one on the left is an anterior view showing the two largest lobes of the liver. The liver is divided up externally into four different lobes. The largest lobe that you see right here is the right lobe of the liver. Gallbladder is located just inferior to the right lobe. That's another accessory organ. Come back to hear that in just a minute. The second largest lobe is the left lobe of the liver, well, which you can also see from an anterior view. Now there's two other smaller lobes. To see the smaller lobes, you have to look at the inferior side of the liver, which is shown here on the right-hand side. So there's the smallest lobe is right in this area right here, right next to the inferior vena cava, which passes through the liver. This lobe right here looks like a little tail. Actually, to me, it sort of looks like a snake's head, but anatomists thought it looked like a tail, so they call that the caudate lobe, because caudate means tail. And then there's another one right here that is sort of rectangular in shape. That's called the quadrate lobe. Quadrate means four-sided because it's somewhat rectangular in shape. It has four sides. Okay. So internally, the liver is divided up into thin sheets of tissue called hepatic plates. And the cells that make up those hepatic plates secrete bile into the spaces between the hepatic plates. And that bile eventually travels through small bile ducts and eventually is released into the duodenum. On the other side of the hepatic plates, there's spaces filled with blood. Those are called the hepatic sinusoids. And the blood carries nutrients into the liver, and then some of those nutrients are absorbed by the liver, like glucose is absorbed, and then it's converted into glycogen, which is a complex carbohydrate that is used to store the glucose. All right. Now, the ducts in the liver, which are called hepatic ducts that drain that bile, eventually come together to form a common hepatic duct. And then the common hepatic duct combines with a duct from the gallbladder. It's called the cystic duct to form the bile duct, or what's sometimes is called the common bile duct. The common bile duct then carries the bile down through the pancreas, where it combines with the pancreatic duct to form a larger duct that connects with the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Now, this portion down here, this very last portion of this duct system of the liver and the pancreas is called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And that receives secretions from both the pancreas as well as the bile from the liver. And then there's a sphincter right where this duct enters the duodenum called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. When that relaxes, that allows the secretions from the pancreas and the liver to enter the small intestine. Now, the gallbladder, which is located just under the right lobe of the liver, is also connected to this duct system. And the gallbladder doesn't really secrete anything. It's just a storage area for bile. And the way it stores bile is that when there's no fat in your stomach, this hepatopancreatic sphincter is closed off. It constricts and it closes off that opening into the small intestine. When that happens, bile backs up. Since it can't go down in the small intestine, it backs up into the gallbladder, where the bile is stored. And then when fat enters the stomach, then when it enters the duodenum, this sphincter opens up, and that allows the bile that was stored in the gallbladder then to flow down into the small intestine, where that bile breaks down large fat droplets into smaller fat droplets. There's also a large number of enzymes that are secreted by the pancreas, including pancreatic lipase. which breaks down those small fat droplets into the individual components of fat. The two main components of fat or triglycerides is glycerol and fatty acids. And so the lipase breaks down triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol can be converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and it can go into glycolysis. Triglycerides are broken down by the liver into acetyl coenzyme A, which can go into the Krebs cycle. All right, so the pancreas produces a large number of different substances. It's a mixture of enzymes and bicarbonate and water called pancreatic juice. About 1,200 to 1,500 milliliters of pancreatic juice is secreted per day. It contains water, zymogens, which are inactive enzymes, pancreatic amylase, which breaks down starch, pancreatic lipase, which breaks down lipids, deoxyribonuclease, which breaks down DNA, ribonuclease, which breaks down RNA. It also produces a large amount of bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate is important because that's what neutralizes the acid from the stomach. So if your pancreas didn't produce bicarbonate, then the stomach acid would eat away at your small intestines, and it would cause ulcers in your small intestines, which could become infected and could cause a serious infection. And also, there are electrolytes in the pancreatic juice. So basically, pretty much all the enzymes you need to break down all 4 major macromolecules are produced by the pancreas. So one of the reasons why pancreatic cancer is so serious, pancreatic cancer is very difficult to treat. Pancreatic tumors sometimes block that duct system that allows the enzymes from the pancreas to go into the small intestine. If those enzymes can't get down there, and if the bicarbonate especially can't get down in the small intestine, then the acid from the stomach is going to start breaking down the wall of the small intestine. So pancreatic cancer is one of the most lethal forms of cancer. It's very, very difficult to treat. Okay, so the small intestines, next part of the digestive system, they carry out nearly all chemical digestion and nearly all absorption of nutrients. The name small intestine refers to its small diameter, not its length. And as I said earlier, on Monday, the small intestine is shorter in a living person because when you die, those smooth muscles in its walls relax, and when it relaxes, when those longitudinal fibers relax, it gets longer. It stretches out, becomes longer. So it's little under 3 to 4.5 meters long in a living person, but it can be almost twice as long, about 2.5 times as long. Well, excuse me, 1.5 times as long in a cadaver. So the small intestines are divided up into 3 different regions. And externally, the only way you can distinguish these 3 regions is based on the location, because externally all 3 parts of these small intestines look the same. They're rather smooth on the out. It's just a long, hollow cylinder that's smooth externally. If you were just to if you were just to cut out a small piece of the small intestine and look at it, there'd be no way you could tell which region it came from, just with your naked eyes. Now there are some differences histologically that can be identified from a cross-section under a microscope, but other than knowing the relative location of that region, you wouldn't be able to tell which region it came from. So about the first 10 inches of the small intestine is the duodenum, which receives secretions from the liver and also the pancreas. Then the middle part is called the jejunum. The jejunum is about 1 to 1.7 meters in length in a living person. And then the distal-most part of the small intestine, and also the longest part, is the ileum. Ileum is about 1.6 to 2.7 meters long. The ileum is continuous with the large intestine. It connects to the large intestine. Okay. So, as I said, you can't really tell these apart externally other than just their relative location, because the first part of the small intestine that's connected to the stomach, that's the duodenum. The last part that's connected to the large intestine is the ileum, and the jejunum is in between. But if you look at a cross-section through the microscope, there are features that you can use to identify the region it came from. For example, the duodenum has a mucosa, a submucosa, a muscularis, and a serosa. And the way you can tell a section through the small intestine came from the duodenum is that the submucosa, which is this light-colored layer, is just packed full of glands called duodenal glands. Duodenal glands, the part of the duodenum that secretes the enzymes. It secretes some of the enzymes. It secretes some proteases that break down protein. Okay. So up here on the top is the mucosa, which is folded into little finger-like structures called villi. Increases the surface area available for absorption. Then the slighter area is the submucosa, which, if you look at this at higher magnification, you could see glands that sort of look like the tubules of the kidney in cross-section. You can tell that it's glandular tissue. And then this next layer is the muscularis. There's a circulated layer and then another longitudinal layer. And then outside of that would be the serosa, which you can't see in this view. It's cut off in the picture. Then, if you look at a cross-section through the jejunum, the one thing that allows you to identify the jejunum is that there are no specialized structures in its walls. It just has the 4 generalized layers. So you have down here, this is just reversed. This is looking at kind of the opposite side of the intestines. This is the mucosa down here, which contains a simple columnar epithelium. Then this layer up here, this more diffuse layer, is the submucosa. The one thing that's unique about the submucosa of the jejunum is there's nothing unique. There's just connective tissue in there. Connective tissue and maybe a few blood vessels, and that's it. There's no specialized glands or lymphatic tissue in the submucosa of the jejunum. And then out here is the tunica muscularis, and then the serosa is on the outside. So there's really no specialized features found in the jejunum. And then finally, this is a cross-section through the ileum. This one, the lumen is on the lower left, and so the first layer you see here on the lower left, this is the mucosa. And then this layer right along here is the submucosa. Now, in the ileum, and also in the appendix, there are concentrations of lymphocytes that are found in little clusters in the submucosa. those clusters of lymphocytes are called lymphatic tissue. And so these darker purple staining areas in the submucosa are called mesenteric patches. And those contain lymphocytes. They don't really make up a lymphatic organ because they're not surrounded by connective tissue. They're just concentrations of lymphocytes. But what those lymphocytes do in the small intestine is they sample the bacteria that are in the lumen of the intestine. And they monitor the kinds of bacteria that are in our intestines. They make sure that the bacteria that are there are only those parts of our microbiota that are friendly, that help keep us healthy. There are bacteria in our intestines that do things like synthesizing vitamin K, which you need for proper blood clotting. Because our bodies can't produce vitamin K ourselves, but there are some bacteria that can. So these lymphocytes that live in these mesenteric patches, they monitor the types of bacteria. If it's one of our good bacteria that helps to keep us healthy, then those lymphocytes will not attack those bacterial cells. But if they detect a pathogen that could potentially be harmful, then these lymphocytes can mobilize an immune response, and they can fight off that infection. So this is the submucosa. So the submucosa of the ileum has mesenteric patches that contain lymphocytes. They monitor our bacteria in our intestines. And then this lighter pink layer out here is the muscularis. And then finally on the outside of that, there's a thin layer of serosa. Okay. So you can distinguish the different regions of the small intestine histologically. It's a little harder to distinguish the regions visually or externally, except based on the relative positions of those regions. Now, one of the two major functions of the small intestine is absorption of nutrients. Once our food molecules are broken down into small enough molecules that can be absorbed, things like glucose and amino acids. And there's a number of features internally of the small intestines that function to increase absorption. There's actually 4 different features of the small intestine. One of them is the long length. The small intestines are all coiled up, so the length of the small intestine can be longer. And the longer the small intestine is, the greater the surface area there is for absorption. Okay? Then, if you look inside the small intestines, the mucosa is folded up to form circular ridges or folds on the inside. And those circular ridges or spiral ridges are called the plepi circulares. And those also increases, because they're ridges, elevated ridges, that increases the surface area for absorption. Then the mucosa of the small intestine is also folded up into little finger-like folds. They sort of look like little fingers. Those finger-like folds are called villi. Those also increase the surface area for absorption. Having those finger-like folds, it's just like our cerebrum is convoluted. That convolution increases the area that can contain neurons in our brain. So these features increase the surface area available for absorption. And then finally, on the luminal surface or side of the columnar cells that make up the mucosa, there are microscopic folds called microvilli. Those microvilli greatly increases the surface area for absorption. So there's 4 different features of the small intestine that increase the surface area for absorption. So these microvilli kind of look like the bristles of a brush, like of a paintbrush. They call that a brush border. And that brush border also, those microvilli contain enzymes. They're embedded into the cell membrane of the microvilli. Those enzymes carry out what's called contact digestion. So any substrates that come in contact with those enzymes are broken down. So this contact digestion is different than external digestion. Most molecules are digested externally because they're inside the lumen. They're not digested inside the cells, but they're digested in the lumen of the intestines, which is actually continuous with our mouth and our anus. So technically it's outside the body. So this just shows a diagram of these different adaptations. So these are the circular folds or plici circulares that increase the surface area available for absorption. These circular folds also probably kind of slow down the movement of the food through the small intestines, and slower it moves, the more more molecules can be absorbed. And then here, this middle diagram shows the villi, which are the little finger-like folds. And then you have to look very, very closely, but if you look at the luminal border of the columnar cells, you'll see microvilli. And that probably increases, since those are so small, that increases the surface area for absorption much more than the other features. Also notice, so this is a large view over here on the right of the villi, showing the columnar cells that have the microvilli. Microvilli are hard to see because they're so small. But notice that right in the middle of each villus, you can see three things. There's some blood vessels that are blue, there's some blood vessels that are red, and then in between them is a green structure. That green structure is part of our lymphatic system, and it's called a lacteal. And what lacteals do is they absorb lipids. That's how lipids are absorbed. They're absorbed into this, it's a type of lymph capillary called a lacteal. And so lipids don't go into these blood vessels and are absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Instead, they go into the lacteals, and then they go through our lymphatic system before they empty into either the right subclavian vein or the left subclavian vein. And then and only then do they enter our bloodstream. So lipids are absorbed differently than other nutrients. All other nutrients are absorbed by these capillaries that are found in the middle of those villi. Okay, then the next part of our digestive tract is the large intestine. I'm going to be going through this pretty quickly, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. The large intestine, large intestine is where most of the absorption of water as well as compaction of the feces occurs. If you absorb the water, the feces become more compact, so the two are kind of related. So food from the ileum enters the large intestine through an ileocecal valve, and right at the very beginning of the large intestine, there's a small pouch that's called the cecum. And in other animals that are herbivores that feed on plant material, some of them, in fact most of them, have a very large cecum. It's a very large pouch-like cecum. That cecum contains symbiotic microbes that can break down cellulose. So that's what allows animals like horses and pigs to break down, to eat plant material, and they can, the microbes help them break down the cellulose into glucose. Because glucose is what cellulose is made of. Animals do not produce cellulase, though they can break down cellulose. So they have to have places for symbiotic bacteria, and protozoans to live that can do that for them, because microbes can produce cellulase. Okay, then there's also a little finger-like structure that sticks off of the cecum. This is thought to actually be a remnant of a larger cecum that our ancestors may have once had. And this little finger-like structure is called the appendix. It's thought to be a vestigial cecum. And at one time it was thought that the appendix didn't have a function. It was just an evolutionary holdover. And sometimes it does get infected, and then you have to have an appendectomy to remove it. Otherwise it ruptures and infection can spread through your body. But now biologists think that the appendix really may have a function, because if you look at its walls, it does have lymphatic tissue. And that lymphatic tissue may play a role in helping to fight off infection. All right, so the large intestines then, as a whole, the large intestine that forms part of the GI tract, is divided up into 4 different regions. Okay, small intestine is only divided up into 3. The first region, in which the food, or the remainder of the undigested food, moves in a superior direction, moves up. This is called the ascending colon, because food ascends in that part of it. Then this part, which is positioned in the transverse plane, is called the transverse colon. And then this third part is called the descending colon, because food descends down through that part. And then the last part of the large intestine is called the sigmoid colon, because it's kind of an S shape. All right. So externally, the large intestine does not look as smooth as the small intestine, because the walls of the large intestine have small pouches that are called haustrum. So this is a haustrum. It's a little pouch that sticks out. And then there's also longitudinal ridges of smooth muscle that you can see from the outside that are called, these are called tinea coli. Sort of looks like a tapeworm. I think that's what the name tinea comes from. Tinea is a very common genus of tapeworms. So it's just a long ridge of smooth muscle you can see externally. In addition, there are often little tiny globules of fat that are attached to the outside of the large intestine. Those little fat globules are sometimes referred to as omental appendages or epiploic appendages. There's 2 different names for those. On our textbook, the current name is omental appendages. Those are just storage areas for fat, where our body stores fat if we get a surplus of nutrients. All right. Okay. Then the next part of the large intestine is the anal canal. The anal canal is where feces are stored before we have a chance to defecate. So they can be stored there until it's more convenient to defecate. Inside the rectum are circular folds called rectal valves. And if you read your textbook, it mentions the function of those. And it's kind of humorous, really. Anybody know what the function of those rectal valves is? Or what it says in our textbook? I don't know if it still does, but it used to say the function of the rectal valves is allows you to pass gas without defecating. So there's a slang term for this. It prevents you from having a shart. Okay. You can You probably guess what that means. It allows you to retain feces while you're passing gas. Okay. When you're sitting in class and have to discreetly try to pass gas. Now that's really what it says. That's what the author of our textbook says in this book. Okay. So the upper part. So just below the intestine, there's a storage area for feces called the rectum, and then there's the anal canal through which the feces pass just before defecation. And in the anal canal there are kind of longitudinal ridges. They're called anal columns. In between the anal columns, there are anal sinuses, and that just helps the feces to slide down through the anal canal and out the anus. So, there's also a large number of veins that surround the anal canal and the anus, and occasionally in some people those veins will bulge out surrounding the anus, and sometimes they can get infected or irritated, and they're referred to as hemorrhoids. And if they get too bad, they bulge out too much, sometimes they have to be removed. Hemorrhoidectomy. So, all right. Well, that is the last part of the digestive tract. So, are there any questions? Okay, that's the end of chapter 25. So don't forget, start working on your Connect assignments, and I will get the last one assigned right after class today.